In 220 AD, the Han Dynasty collapsed, not because a foreign army crossed its borders, but because 3 of its own generals decided they wanted the empire for themselves. Archaeologists excavating a tomb near Anyang in Hainan province in 2009 found what may be the burial site of Cao Cao, the most powerful of those. 3 men, the warlord who had spent 20 years holding the empire together in the name of an emperor he controlled like a puppet. The tomb contained military equipment, iron armor, and a stone tablet inscribed with the words, "The Tomb of the Martial King of Wei." DNA analysis of the skeletal remains published in 2023 identified a Y chromosome haplogroup consistent with historical records of Cao Cao's clan. The man who ended the Han Dynasty left behind a body that scientists could still identify 2,000 years later, but his empire lasted less than 40 years after he died. The Han Dynasty, at its peak, governed 60 million people, 1/4 of the entire human population of the Earth at that time. It invented paper, it opened the Silk Road, it built a bureaucratic examination system that the world still uses. The ethnic identity of 92% of China's population today, Han Chinese, is named after it, and it was destroyed by 3 men who could not share. So here is the question that every historian of China keeps coming back to. How does an empire that names a civilization, that creates the identity that over 1 billion people carry today, fail to survive its own success? The Han Dynasty was not the first attempt to unify China. It was the second, and it succeeded precisely because it had watched the first attempt destroy itself through the specific failure of trying to change everything at once. The Qin Dynasty, which unified the warring states in 221 BC under the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, lasted 15 years. In that 15 years, it built the Great Wall, standardized weights and measures, unified the writing system, and imposed a legal code so severe that historical sources describe officials executing people for arriving at work late. The Qin first emperor was one of the most effective state builders in human history. He was also one of the most hated rulers China ever produced. When he died in 210 BC, the empire he had unified by sheer force of will began coming apart within months. His son, the second emperor, was managed by a court eunuch named Cao Cao, who systematically eliminated every official capable of effective governance, kept the emperor in ignorance of the rebellions spreading across the empire, and eventually orchestrated the emperor's suicide when the situation became irretrievable. This is not myth. The historian Sima Qian, writing approximately a century later, documented the sequence in detail that subsequent archaeological evidence has largely confirmed. The Qin court's internal dysfunction in its final years is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of palace politics destroying an otherwise functional state in all of ancient history. The chaos that followed the Qin collapse was not a simple power vacuum. It was a genuine civil war among multiple competing forces, former Qin officials, resurgent nobility from the pre-Qing kingdoms, and local strongmen who had raised armies to survive the upheaval and found that armies were useful for purposes beyond survival. The 2 most significant contestants were Xiang Yu, a military aristocrat of extraordinary physical ability and tactical brilliance who had never lost a battle he personally commanded, and Liu Bang, a minor official of peasant origin who kept losing battles but kept surviving them, building alliances, and absorbing the followers of the commanders he had defeated. The contest between Xiang Yu and Liu Bang was not simply a military competition. It was an argument about what kind of state would follow the Qin. Xiang Yu wanted to restore the pre-Qin order of multiple kingdoms governed by aristocratic lineages. Liu Bang, without necessarily having a clear ideological program, built a coalition based on merit and pragmatic loyalty rather than aristocratic right. When Liu Bang won, defeating Xiang Yu at the Battle of Geisha in 202 BC in a campaign whose specific tactics are documented in enough detail to have been studied by military historians across every subsequent era. The Han Dynasty that he founded began with a specific lesson from the Qin embedded in its institutional DNA: rule lightly enough that people do not feel the need to rebel. Liu Bang, who became Emperor Gaozu, the high ancestor of the Han Dynasty, is one of the most improbable founders in the history of any major civilization. He was not a nobleman. He was not a general from a distinguished military family. He was, by the account of Sima Qian's Shiji, the records of the grand historian, written approximately a century after Liu Bang's death, and still the primary source for the dynasty's founding. A man who had been a minor village official, who drank too much, who borrowed money he did not repay, and who had a habit of showing up late to events that he was supposed to be organizing. What Liu Bang had, that nobody in his social environment expected a man of his origin to have, was political intelligence of an unusual quality, specifically the ability to make capable people want to serve him. The commanders who eventually delivered his victories, Han Xin, the greatest military mind of the era, Zhang Liang, the strategist who designed the campaigns, Xiao He, the administrator who kept the logistics functioning, were all men of greater individual ability in their specific domains than Liu Bang himself. What Liu Bang provided was the political authority that held them together and the personal flexibility to use their talents without being threatened by them. The founding legend of the Han Dynasty, which Sima Qian records with a straight face while providing enough documentary context for modern historians to assess its political function, involves Liu Bang's birth being announced by a divine dragon appearing to his mother and a red aura visible to visitors around his sleeping body. These stories were standard political mythology for a dynasty needing to legitimize its founders' very non-aristocratic origins. They are interesting not because they are true, but because they represent a specific argument, that heaven's mandate, the traditional Chinese concept of divine authorization for political authority, was available to any man whom heaven chose, regardless of birth. This was not a small political claim, it was a revolutionary one, and it was consistent with the practical reality of how Liu Bang had actually achieved power, through demonstrated ability, through the loyalty he cultivated, and through the specific contingencies of a civil war in which aristocratic birth had proven insufficient to guarantee success. The genetic evidence for the Han Chinese identity that the dynasty created is one of the most extensively studied questions in East Asian population genetics. The Han ethnic category, which today encompasses approximately 1.4 billion people and constitutes the largest single ethnic group in the world, was not a pre-existing genetic reality that the dynasty named. It was a political and cultural construction that the dynasty created, whose geographic expansion followed the expansion of Han political authority and cultural influence rather than the migration of a distinct population. Modern population genetics studies, including large-scale genome-wide analyses published between 2009 and 2023, consistently show that Han Chinese is a culturally defined category with significant underlying genetic diversity that reflects the diverse regional populations it absorbed across 2,000 years of expansion. China's geography is, like every civilization's geography, both an opportunity and a constraint, and the specific opportunities and constraints of the Chinese landscape shaped the Han Dynasty's political organization, military priorities, and economic development in ways that are still visible in contemporary China's administrative and cultural geography. The Yellow River, Huanghe, is the defining geographic feature of northern China and the cradle of Chinese civilization in a more direct and immediate sense than any other river in world history. Its lowest deposits, the fine-grained soil blown from Central Asian deserts over millions of years and accumulated in the river basin to depths of hundreds of meters, are among the most fertile agricultural soils anywhere on Earth. But the Yellow River is also, by a combination of its extremely high sediment load and its tendency to shift course catastrophically, the most dangerous river in human history. Historical records document at least 26 major course changes and over 1,500 significant floods across Chinese recorded history. The river that fed Chinese civilization was also capable of drowning it, and the management of its flooding was one of the central administrative challenges of the Han state. The Silk Road, the network of overland trade routes that connected the Han Empire to Central Asia, Persia, the Levant, and eventually Rome, was not in the Han period a single road with a single origin and destination. It was a shifting system of routes through the Tarim Basin and across the Central Asian steppe, whose specific configurations changed with the political conditions of the territories through which they passed. The Han Dynasty's military campaigns westward, particularly those of Emperor Wu, were motivated as much by the need to secure these trade routes against the Xiongnu Confederacy that controlled the Central Asian steppe as by any territorial ambition for the regions themselves. The specific strategic challenge that the Xiongnu posed was not primarily military in the conventional sense. The Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic peoples occupying the steppe north of Han China, whose military effectiveness derived from their universal horse-riding capability and their operational flexibility in the vast open spaces of Inner Asia, could not be defeated in the way that a settled state with fixed cities and agricultural populations could be defeated. Their armies dissolved into the steppe when confronted with superior force and reassembled when the threat withdrew. The military response that Emperor Wu developed, maintaining offensive campaigns deep into the steppe rather than simply defending the frontier, was expensive, logistically demanding, and only partially effective. The political response, the Hekin marriage alliances, through which Han emperors sent imperial princesses to Xiongnu leaders as political gifts, was humiliating by the standards of the imperial court, but pragmatically effective in buying periods of peace. The Yangtze River Valley, the great river system of central and southern China, was, in the Han period, a frontier zone rather than the agricultural and commercial core it would become in subsequent dynasties. Its development during the Han period, through the extension of wet rice cultivations southward from the original Yellow River agricultural zone, was one of the most significant economic transformations of the dynasty's history, adding productive agricultural territory that would eventually become more important to Chinese civilization than the northern heartland in which it had originated. The Han dynasty's transformation from the fragile political construction that Liu Bang assembled from the wreckage of the Qin collapse to the consolidated empire that Emperor Wu would deploy across Asia took approximately 80 years. 3 generations of emperors whose specific policy choices built the institutional framework that made the dynasty's subsequent achievements possible. Liu Bang's own approach to governance was shaped by the very specific lesson of the Qin's failure. He understood, and the Confucian and Taoist advisors who staffed his court articulated clearly, that the Qin had destroyed itself through excessive demands on its population. The corvée labor obligations that had built the Great Wall, the imperial roads, and the mausoleum of the first emperor had impoverished the peasant households whose agricultural production was the foundation of the entire system. Liu Bang's response was to reduce taxes dramatically, recall the Qin's most onerous labor obligations, and allow the agricultural economy to recover from a decade of civil war and state extraction. The agricultural recovery of the early Han period is documented in the surviving tax records and census data from the dynasty, sources that are, by the standards of ancient record-keeping, unusually detailed, and whose analysis by modern historians has revealed a pattern of population growth and agricultural intensification that explains the dynasty's subsequent economic strength. The population of Han China, which had been perhaps 25 to 30 million people at the dynasty's founding, had grown to approximately 60 million by the Eastern Han period, a doubling that required both the recovery of land damaged by war and the opening of new agricultural territory through irrigation expansion and the settlement of previously uncultivated regions. The civil service examination system that the Han dynasty developed, drawing on the Confucian emphasis on education as the foundation of good governance, was the most significant institutional innovation the dynasty's early period and the one with the longest historical reach. The principle that government appointments should be based on demonstrated intellectual competence rather than hereditary right, tested through examinations whose content emphasized the Confucian classics and administrative procedures and the ethical reasoning required for good governance, was, in its Han period form, not yet the fully developed meritocratic system that later dynasties would elaborate, but it established a principle whose influence on Chinese governance persisted for 2,000 years until the examination system was formally abolished in 1905. Emperor Gaozu's successors, particularly his son Emperor Hui and his powerful widow, Empress Lu, who effectively governed during the reign of child emperors for approximately 15 years, maintained a policy of light governance that the dynasty's founding required. The specific measures they took, reducing the rate of grain taxation, limiting the mobilization of peasant labor, and allowing the merchant class to accumulate wealth in ways the Qin had prohibited, were not ideologically motivated by any commitment to economic liberalism. They were pragmatic responses to the reality that an exhausted and impoverished agricultural population could not be squeezed for resources it did not have. The Han military was, at its peak under Emperor Wu, the most powerful in Asia, a combined arms force of infantry and cavalry and logistical infrastructure that conducted campaigns over distances and in terrain that challenged the operational limits of ancient military organization. Understanding how it was built, what made it effective, and what eventually exhausted it is essential to understanding both the dynasty's peak achievements and the fiscal crisis that initiated its decline. The crossbow was the defining weapon of Han infantry. The Chinese repeating crossbow, the Chuku Nu, allowed trained soldiers to maintain a rate of fire significantly faster than archers using conventional bows, and the standardized bronze trigger mechanisms that have been recovered in large numbers from Han period military sites demonstrate a manufacturing consistency that implies organized military production rather than individual craft production. The crossbow's mechanical advantage, allowing soldiers of ordinary upper body strength to draw the weapon by using the legs, meant that the skill gap between trained crossbowmen and untrained militia was smaller than with conventional archery, which required years of practice to develop the muscular strength for effective use. The cavalry that Emperor Wu developed for his Xiongnu campaigns was, in its origins, an adaptation forced by military necessity. Han infantry, however effective against settled armies, was unable to pursue and destroy Xiongnu cavalry forces in the open steppe. The nomads simply outran them. The solution was to build a cavalry force comparable in mobility to the Xiongnu, which required importing the specific horse breeds from Central Asia. The blood-sweeting Fergana horses, whose larger size and greater stamina made them superior to the smaller steppe ponies of the Xiongnu, that could carry armoured cavalry soldiers at the speeds required for steppe warfare. The specific military campaigns that Emperor Wu conducted against the Xiongnu between approximately 129 and 90 BC, a 40-year series of expeditions into the Mongolian steppe that involved armies of hundreds of thousands of soldiers operating thousands of kilometers from their supply bases, were, by the operational standards of any era, extraordinarily ambitious logistical undertakings. The supply chains required to maintain armies of this size at this distance, grain, weapons, horses, and the equipment for hundreds of thousands of soldiers transported by ox cart and human porter across deserts and mountain passes, consumed a fraction of Han China's total agricultural surplus that modern historians estimate at something between 20 and 40% of the empire's total annual revenue during the most intense phases of the campaigns. The military engineering capability of the Han army was as impressive as its combat effectiveness. The road network that Han military engineers maintained, particularly in the difficult terrain of the Qinling Mountains, separating the Wei River Valley from the Sichuan Basin, involved cut-stone construction, wooden plank roads cantilevered from cliff faces, and bridging techniques whose remains have been studied by modern engineers with genuine admiration. Han military logistics operated at a scale and sophistication that no contemporary military force could match. Emperor Wu, Han Wudi, the martial emperor, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC, represents the Han Dynasty, its most powerful, most ambitious, and most fiscally reckless, a ruler whose genuine achievements in territorial expansion, institutional development, and cultural patronage were purchased at costs that his successors spent generations trying to manage. He came to the throne at 16 and ruled for 54 years, one of the longest reigns in Chinese imperial history. By any conventional measure of imperial achievement, his reign was extraordinary. He extended Han territory westward to Central Asia, northward deep into the Mongolian steppe, southward into Vietnam, and eastward into Korea. He established the Imperial State University, the Taishui, that institutionalized Confucian education as the foundation of the civil service. He patronized the historian Sima Qian, whose Shiji remains the foundational text of Chinese historiography, and he was personally responsible for decisions that killed hundreds of thousands of his own subjects and drove the empire's finances into a crisis from which it never fully recovered. The fiscal measures that Emperor Wu adopted to fund his military campaigns were innovative, extractive, and ultimately destructive. He nationalized the salt and iron industries, the two most important commodity sectors of the Han economy, converting them from private enterprises to state monopolies, whose revenues flowed directly to the imperial treasury rather than to private merchants. He issued a new currency, debased the previous coinage, and effectively taxed commercial enterprises through the vehicle law that required merchants to register their goods and pay a percentage of their value to the state. He sold official titles and noble ranks for cash contributions to the military fund. These measures generated revenue. They also generated the specific forms of economic distortion that historians recognize as the symptoms of fiscal desperation. The diversion of commercial activity into untaxed channels, the reduction of private investment in the productive enterprises being taxed, and the administrative corruption that tends to follow the creation of new revenue extraction mechanisms faster than the oversight systems that might control their abuse. By the end of Emperor Wu's reign, Han China's economy had been significantly damaged by the fiscal demands of his military programs and the advisors who had opposed those programs, notably the Confucian official Dong Fangshuo, had been proven correct in their predictions about the consequences. The succession crisis that followed Emperor Wu's death, in which multiple potential heirs had been eliminated through court politics during his reign, leaving a child emperor whose regents competed for control, was the direct product of the personal, political style that had made him effective as an emperor. His willingness to eliminate potential rivals, his distrust of any official who accumulated too much independent authority, and his tendency to make major decisions without the institutional consultation that the Confucian system prescribed had gutted the court of the capable administrators who might have managed the transition effectively. For the 60 million people who lived within the Han Empire at its demographic peak, daily life was shaped by the agricultural calendar, the tax obligations of the state, the social hierarchies that Confucian ideology prescribed, and the specific material culture that the dynasty's commercial economy provided. The peasant household was the fundamental unit of Han's social and economic organization, and its specific obligations, grain taxes, labor service, and military service, were calibrated, in theory, to leave enough surplus for household reproduction and gradual accumulation. In practice, the calibration was rarely maintained through periods of military expenditure, and the gap between the prescribed tax rates and the actual extraction that occurred through the combination of official taxes, local surcharges, and the informal demands of the administrative officials closest to the peasant population was a persistent source of the rural distress that punctuated the dynasty's history with periodic rebellions. The diet of ordinary Han subjects was dominated by millet and rice, with the specific grain varying by region, millet in the north, rice in the south, supplemented by soybeans, vegetables, and whatever animal protein was available from hunting, fishing, or the small livestock that farming households maintained. The archaeological evidence for Han period food culture is unusually rich because of the dynasty's burial practices. The principle that the dead required provisions for the afterlife led to the placement of food containers, ceramics, lacquerware, and in some cases, the preserved remains of actual food. In Han tombs whose contents have been studied by archaeologists and by food historians seeking to reconstruct the material culture of the period. The famous Mawangdui tombs near Changsha in Hunan province, excavated in 1972 and 1973, contained the remarkably well-preserved body of a woman who died approximately 160 T8 BC, along with over 1,000 objects including silk garments, lacquerware, and a collection of texts written on silk and bamboo strips that included medical treatises, astronomical texts, and philosophical works. The analysis of the preserved body found evidence of conditions including arteriosclerosis, gallstones and tuberculosis, and the stomach contents showed she had consumed melon seeds shortly before her death. This is not simply antiquarian detail. It is a window into the specific material reality of an aristocratic Han woman's life at a level of intimacy that documentary sources alone cannot provide. The Confucian social hierarchy that the Han state promoted, placing scholars at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants, with various categories of bondservants and slaves below, was more aspirational than descriptive. The actual social dynamics of Han China involved significant social mobility through military service, commercial success, and the acquisition of education that the civil service examination system rewarded. The merchant class, officially ranked below farmers, frequently accumulated wealth that allowed their descendants to purchase the education and social connections required for examination success and official appointment. Chang'an, the Han Dynasty's capital, located in the Wei River Valley of what is now Shaanxi Province, was, for most of the dynasty's Western Han period, the largest and most elaborate city in the world. Its population at the dynasty's peak has been estimated by archaeologists and historians at between 250,000 and 400,000 people within the city walls, with additional populations in suburban areas, bringing the metropolitan total higher. This was comparable to Rome at its height and larger than any other city in the world outside these two imperial capitals. The physical layout of Chang'an was organized around the imperial palace complexes that occupied the northern portion of the city. The Weiyang Palace, begun by Liu Bang's successor Emperor Hui, covered approximately 8 square kilometers, and was the largest palace complex in the ancient world at the time of its construction, substantially larger than the Forbidden City that would replace it 1,400 years later. The palace required approximately 144 Zuzas and labourers to build, according to historical records, and its construction was one of the projects that the early Han court's Confucian advisors criticised as excessive given the still recovering state of the post-Qin economy. Archaeological excavations at the Chang'an site, conducted by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and by teams from Xi'an's archaeological institutions across multiple field seasons since the 1950s, have revealed the city's physical infrastructure in progressively greater detail. The city walls, constructed of rammed earth to a height of approximately 12 meters and a width of 12 to 16 meters at the base, survive in sections whose physical condition allows detailed analysis of the construction techniques employed. The drainage system that managed rainwater and sewage within the city, a network of underground ceramic pipes, whose fragments are recovered in quantity from every excavated area of the site, demonstrates a level of urban sanitary infrastructure comparable to the best Roman urban engineering of the same period. The market districts of Chang'an were organized into two main market complexes, the Eastern Market and the Western Market. whose commercial activity drew traders from across the Han Empire and from the Silk Road territories to the west. The specific commodities available in these markets, silk, lacquerware, bronze vessels, ceramics, iron tools, horses, and the spices and luxury goods that arrived via the Silk Road from Central Asia and beyond, reflected the empire's geographic reach and its commercial sophistication. The regulation of these markets, including the standardized weights and measures that the Han state maintained, was one of the most concrete expressions of the dynasty's administrative reach into the daily commercial life of its subjects. The Eastern Han capital at Luoyang, to which the capital was moved in 25 AD after the interregnum of Wang Mang, was rebuilt after the Civil War that restored Han authority and developed into a city of comparable scale and sophistication to Chang'an. Recent excavations at the Luoyang site have revealed a city plan of considerable regularity and a building tradition that echoed the architectural vocabulary of the Western Han capital while incorporating innovations in ceramic tile production, drainage engineering, and residential architecture that reflect the continued development of Chinese urban technology. The religious life of Han China was organized around a combination of state ritual, ancestor veneration, and the diverse popular religious practices of a vast and ethnically diverse empire whose regional traditions had been partially but never completely homogenized by the dynasty's administrative unification. The state religion of the Han court was a syncretic system that combined elements from multiple pre-Han traditions. The sacrificial rituals associated with the Zhou dynasty's heaven worship, the shamanic traditions of the northern steppe peoples that the Han state had absorbed, and the specific cosmological theories that the court's ritual specialists had developed to provide an intellectual framework for the emperor's ceremonial responsibilities. The emperor's ritual function, his responsibility for performing the specific sacrifices and ceremonies that maintained the correct relationship between the human world and the cosmic order, was not a peripheral aspect of his role. It was, in traditional Chinese political theory, one of his most essential obligations, and his failure to perform these rituals correctly was understood as a potential cause of the natural disasters, floods, droughts, earthquakes that the dynasty's records document with careful attention. The afterlife beliefs expressed in Han burial practice were complex and not entirely consistent, reflecting the coexistence of multiple religious traditions within the empire rather than a single unified theology. The practice of equipping the dead with the goods required for continued existence, food, tools, clothing, weapons, and in some cases replicas of the servants and entertainers who had accompanied the deceased in life, implies a belief in continued personal existence after death that required material provision. The specifically Han elaboration of this practice, the jade burial suits that were constructed for members of the imperial family, in which the body was encased in thousands of pieces of jade sewn together with gold, silver, or bronze wire, was based on the belief that jade had specific properties that could prevent bodily decomposition and thus allow the soul to maintain its connection to the physical form. The discovery of complete jade burial suits in multiple Han royal tombs, including the tombs of Liu Sheng, Prince of Zhongshan, and his wife Do Wan at Mancheng in Hebei province, excavated in 1968, provided physical confirmation of the burial practice described in Han texts and allowed materials analysis of the jade and metalwork that revealed both the quality of craftsmanship and the specific regional sources of the jade used. The suits required between 2,000 and 3,000 jade plaques each, sewn together with wire of the appropriate metal for the status of the deceased, gold for imperial family members, silver for nobles, bronze for officials. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD, the millenarian religious uprising that was the first major symptom of the Eastern Han's terminal crisis, was motivated by the teachings of the Way of the Celestial Masters, a Taoist religious movement that combined ritual healing, communal organization, and an eschatological expectation of a coming age of great peace that would replace the corrupt existing order. The specific organizational form of the Yellow Turbans, a network of local communities, each with a religious leader responsible for both spiritual and temporal welfare, demonstrated that popular religion in Han China had developed the institutional capacity for political mobilization that the court's Confucian orthodoxy had not anticipated and could not easily suppress. The technological achievements of the Han Dynasty were, in several areas, genuinely ahead of anything available in the contemporary world outside China, and the specific innovations that Han engineers, craftsmen, and scholars developed shaped the material culture of Chinese civilization in ways whose traces are still visible in contemporary life. Paper, the technology whose invention is traditionally attributed to the court official Kai Lun in 105 AD, though archaeological evidence now suggests that earlier, cruder forms of paper were produced in China before this date, was the single most consequential technological innovation of the Han period. The specific paper that Cai Lun's account describes was made from a mixture of bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets, a formula that produced a writing surface significantly cheaper, more portable, and more easily produced than the silk and bamboo strips that had previously served as the primary writing materials in China. The democratization of writing that paper made possible, reducing the cost of documentary communication to a fraction of its previous level, had consequences for administration, commerce, education, and cultural production that are still unfolding. The seismograph invented by Zhang Heng in 132 AD, the Hofeng Didongyi, literally the instrument for measuring the seasonal winds and earth movements, was the world's first seismoscope, capable of detecting the direction of distant earthquakes with a mechanical precision that modern engineers have studied carefully. The device consisted of a large bronze vessel with a pendulum inside, surrounded by 8 bronze dragon heads whose mouths held balls. When an earthquake struck, the pendulum's movement caused one of the dragon heads to release its ball into the mouth of a bronze toad below, indicating the earthquake's direction. The instrument detected an earthquake in Gansu province, approximately 500 kilometers from Luoyang, at a time when no human observer in the capital was aware of the event, a fact that was confirmed when messengers arrived from the affected area days later. The steel production that Chinese metallurgists had developed by the Han period, using a combination of cast iron and wrought iron techniques in processes that effectively produced carbon steel, was approximately a millennium ahead of comparable European metallurgical development. The specific techniques, the use of bellows-powered blast furnaces to produce cast iron, and the subsequent processing of cast iron into steel through a combination of decarburization and refining, required both the specific technological knowledge and the organizational infrastructure of large-scale production that Han China's industrial economy could support. The cast iron plows, seed drills, and irrigation equipment that Han agricultural technology deployed across the empire's farming regions are documented in both the textual sources, agricultural treatises, whose practical orientation provides detailed information about farming techniques, and in the archaeological record of tool deposits and artistic representations on Han tomb reliefs. The technological level of Han agriculture was not equaled in Europe until the 18th century. The Han Dynasty's enemies were, throughout its history, a combination of external threats and internal vulnerabilities, and understanding how the balance between them shifted across 4 centuries helps explain why the dynasty survived as long as it did, and why, when it finally collapsed, it collapsed so quickly. The Xiongnu Confederacy was the defining external challenge of the Western Han period, a military and political force whose operational reach across the Central Asian steppe gave it the ability to threaten Han China's northern frontier at will, and whose specific military capabilities, mounted archery at high speed across vast open distances, required the Han military to develop specifically adapted responses rather than simply applying the tactical systems that had worked against the settled kingdoms of the warring states. Period. The relationship between the Han court and the Xiongnu Confederacy was one of the longest and most complex diplomatic relationships in ancient history, spanning approximately 3 centuries and cycling through periods of military conflict, diplomatic accommodation through Hekin marriage alliances, tributary relationships in which the Xiongnu paid nominal homage to Han sovereignty in exchange for material gifts, and eventually the fragmentation of the Xiongnu Confederacy through a combination of Han military pressure and internal succession disputes. The specific process by which the Han court managed this relationship, documented in both Chinese sources and in the oral traditions of the Xiongnu peoples preserved in later Central Asian and steppe histories, is one of the richest case studies in ancient great power diplomacy available from any world region. The court eunuchs who wielded increasing political influence in the Eastern Han period represent a different kind of institutional threat, not foreign military pressure, but the internal corruption of the administrative system that was supposed to provide the emperor with sound governance. Eunuchs had been present in Chinese imperial courts since the Zhou period, their physical modification understood as a guarantee against the specific sexual threat that male officials in proximity to imperial women were presumed to pose. In the Eastern Han, as a succession of child emperors and weak adult emperors allowed their formal advisors to be displaced by palace intimates, the eunuch cliques that controlled access to the emperor's person accumulated political influence that the Confucian scholarly establishment found both threatening and humiliating. The specific dynamic that the eunuch official conflict created, with Confucian officials seeking to purge eunuch influence and eunuchs using their palace access to have opposition officials arrested or executed, consumed the Eastern Han court's political energy during precisely the period when the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD and the subsequent military mobilization against it were creating the regional warlord power that would eventually destroy the dynasty. The court was looking inward at a factional conflict whose significance was real but secondary, while the military commanders who were fighting the Yellow Turbans were building the independent power bases that would make them, within a generation, ungovernable. The Han Dynasty at its territorial maximum, approximately during the reign of Emperor Wu from 141 to 87 BC, controlled a territory covering approximately 6 million square kilometers and governing approximately 55 to 60 million people. By the demographic standards of the ancient world, this was an unprecedented concentration of human and productive resources under a single political authority, and the administrative challenge of governing it was met with an institutional sophistication that impressed and influenced every subsequent dynasty that followed. The Silk Road's opening, which Emperor Wu's military campaigns into Central Asia made possible by establishing a zone of Han military dominance along the routes leading westward, connected Han China to a commercial network extending to Persia, the Roman Empire, and India in a way that transformed both the economics of long-distance trade and the cultural connections of the ancient world. The specific commodities moving eastward along the Silk Road, glass, linen, silver, wool textiles, and various luxury goods from the Mediterranean world, are documented in both Chinese and Western sources of the period, and the archaeological evidence from tomb finds along the route confirms the literary accounts. The silk that moved westward, the commodity whose Chinese monopoly gave the route its name, was the most valued textile in the Roman world, its sheer quality incomprehensible to Roman textile producers who lack the specific sericulture knowledge that China had developed. The administrative infrastructure of the Han peak period, the network of commanderies and counties, each with its roster of officials appointed by the central court, maintaining census records, collecting taxes, managing irrigation and flood control, adjudicating legal disputes, and reporting regularly to the capital, was, by the standards of ancient state organization, an achievement of extraordinary scale and consistency. The survival of portions of Han administrative documentation, in the form of bamboo strip, Documents recovered from archaeological sites, particularly the caches from the northwestern frontier commandery sites, allows modern historians to study the day-to-day functioning of Han provincial administration at a level of detail not available for any other ancient empire of comparable scale. The cultural achievement of the Han peak period was equally substantial. Sima Qian's Shiji, the records of the Grand Historian, completed around 91 BC, established the genre of comprehensive dynastic history that every subsequent Chinese dynasty would produce, and whose specific methodology, combining annals, tables, treatises on specialized topics, and individual biographies, created a model of historical writing that influenced historiography across Eastern Asia for 2,000 years. The philosophical synthesis that the Imperial Academy elaborated, combining Confucian ethical principles with elements of legalist administrative practice and Taoist cosmological thinking, provided the intellectual framework within which Chinese governance would be theorized and practiced until the 20th century. The Han Dynasty's collapse was a process that unfolded across approximately a century, from the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 AD to the formal abdication of the last Han Emperor in 220 AD, and whose specific mechanisms combined fiscal exhaustion, institutional decay, and the specific political consequences of the military mobilization that the dynasty had undertaken to suppress the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was, in scale and geographic reach, the largest popular uprising in Han history. Approximately 360 Zero-Zen rebels, organized in a coordinated network that suggests months of planning, rose simultaneously in multiple provinces in the spring of 184 AD, attacking county seats, burning government buildings, and disrupting the agricultural infrastructure that sustained the empire's tax revenues. The Han court's response, mobilizing regional military forces under locally appointed commanders to suppress the rebellion, was effective in the immediate sense of defeating the Yellow Turbans within about a year. It was catastrophic in its institutional consequences. The commanders who were given regional military authority to suppress the Yellow Turbans, men like Cao Cao, Yuan Shao, Liu Bei, and Sun Jian, built up personal military followings whose loyalty was to their commanders rather than to the Han court. The specific mechanisms was the same one that had undermined every previous Chinese dynasty and that had created the fragmentation the Han had been established to end. When the central government delegated military authority to local commanders, those commanders' interests and the central government's interests diverged. A local commander who had built a loyal army through personal leadership, personal distribution of rewards, and personal management of his soldiers' welfare had an incentive to maintain that army and expand its capabilities, regardless of the central government's preferences. The interregnum of Wang Mang, the scholar official who had effectively controlled the Han court for years through his relationship with the Empress Dowager and who declared himself emperor of a new Qin Dynasty in 9 AD, is a cautionary digression from the main narrative of Han decline, but an instructive one. Wang Mang's attempted reforms, including the nationalization of land, the abolition of slavery, currency reform, and price controls, were ideologically driven by his reading of the Confucian classics and his belief that restoring the institutions of the ancient Zhou period would solve the social problems of his era. They were administratively catastrophic, generating resistance from the wealthy classes whose interests they threatened, confusion in the peasant households whose land tenure arrangements they disrupted, and ultimately the Red Eyebrow Rebellion that overthrew him in 23 AD. The restoration of the Han, the Eastern Han, ruling from Luoyang rather than Chang'an, was achieved by Liu Xiu, a member of the Han imperial family, but at the cost of 15 years of civil war and a demographic collapse whose severity is reflected in the census records of the period. The fiscal deterioration that accelerated through the Eastern Han period was driven by the specific costs of maintaining the military establishment required for the frontier defense against the Xiongnu in the north, the campaigns in Vietnam and Korea that expanded Han territory, at considerable cost, and the ongoing suppression of the internal rebellions that flared repeatedly in provinces where poverty and local administrative abuse had driven the peasant population to armed resistance. The final decades of the Han Dynasty were governed by emperors who were, in the most literal sense, irrelevant to the real political decisions being made in their name. The succession of child emperors who followed Emperor Ling, who died in 189 AD, having spent his reign selling official positions to raise money and allowing court eunuchs to accumulate political power that the Confucian officials found intolerable, were pawns in a conflict among military commanders whose power the dynasty's institutional structure could no longer contain. The specific event that precipitated the final breakdown was the military intervention in the court by Dong Zhuo in 189 AD. Dong Zhuo was the commander of the northwestern frontier forces, experienced, brutal, and politically unsophisticated in the specific court culture of the Han capital. When summoned to Luoyang during the succession crisis that followed Emperor Ling's death, he arrived with his army, deposed the reigning child emperor, installed a different child emperor, executed or drove out the eunuch cliques that had previously controlled court access, and settled in to govern the empire by military force. The response of the other regional commanders, a coalition that fought Dong Zhuo for 2 years before he was assassinated by his own subordinate Lu Bu, was not a restoration of Han authority, but a demonstration that no single commander could impose authority on the others. Cao Cao emerged from this chaos as the most effective political and military operator of the period, a man whose combination of military talent, administrative ability, and cold strategic intelligence allowed him to progressively eliminate his rivals and consolidate control over the Han court and most of northern China. He did not depose the Han emperor. He controlled him, maintaining the imperial institution as a source of legitimate authority for his own appointments while governing in practice as the emperor's chief minister. For 25 years, Cao Cao held the fractured empire together through personal force of will, military campaigns, and administrative competence that the historical record consistently describes as genuine rather than simply impressive. His rivals, Liu Bei in the southwest, claiming descent from the Han imperial family, Sun Quan in the southeast, controlling the commercially productive lower Yangtze Valley, were too strong to be absorbed but too committed to independence to accept integration into Cao Cao's political system. The three-way stalemate that resulted, documented in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the historical novel written 1,000 years later that made the period the most familiar and most romanticized era in Chinese popular history, was not a stable equilibrium. It was a prolonged war of attrition that exhausted all three powers, while the ordinary population of Han China paid the cost in lives, agricultural disruption, and the specific horrors of military occupation. When Cao Cao died in 220 AD, his son Cao Pi formally ended the fiction of Han authority, accepted the abdication of the last Han emperor, Emperor Xian, who had been Cao Cao's puppet for 25 years, and declared the new kingdom of Wei. Liu Bei responded by declaring the continuation of the Han Dynasty in the southwest as the Kingdom of Han, soon renamed Shu Han. Sun Quan formally declared his own Kingdom of Wu. The unified empire that Liu Bang had built 400 years earlier was divided into three. The Han Dynasty ended in 220 AD, but the civilization it created and the identity it named did not end with it. The Han period is, in fundamental ways, still present in the world, in the ethnic identity of over 1 billion people, in the writing system that carries Han civilization's accumulated record, in the institutional patterns that shaped every subsequent Chinese dynasty, and in the specific technologies whose development during the Han period changed human civilization permanently. The archaeological legacy of the Han Dynasty is one of the richest in the world, distributed across hundreds of excavated site China, and studied through the integration of traditional archaeology, materials science, DNA analysis, remote sensing, and digital documentation in ways that are continuously expanding the understanding of what Han civilization actually looked like. The potential tomb of Cao Cao at Anyang, identified in 2009 on the basis of textual evidence, location, and the artifact recovered from the site, including the inscribed stone tablet identifying the occupant, has been one of the most significant and most contested archaeological discoveries of the early 21st century. The identification was initially disputed by some Chinese scholars on the grounds that the evidence was insufficient to make the attribution definitive. Subsequent analysis, including the 2023 DNA study that identified the Y chromosome haplogroup of the skeletal remains as consistent with the genetic profile of contemporary individuals claiming descent from Cao Cao's family in historical genealogies, has strengthened the case for the identification. While acknowledging that absolute certainty is not achievable with the available evidence, the discovery of Han period bamboo strip documents, most significantly the Lieh Qin slips discovered in 2002 in Hunan province, which contained over 36,000 individual bamboo strips with administrative records from the Qin and early Han periods, has transformed the study of early Han administration by providing documentary evidence at a level of operational detail that was previously available only from later periods. These documents record the daily administrative activities of a county-level government, tax assessments, labour requisitions, criminal case records, official correspondence, in ways that make the bureaucratic machinery of the Han state visible from the inside rather than only from the retrospective accounts of court historians. The Silk Road's physical legacy, the caravanserai sites, the Buddhist cave temples, the trading town remains, is distributed across Central Asia in archaeological sites whose excavation has been advancing steadily since the 20th century and whose findings, combined with the analysis of the trade goods recovered from Han period tombs in China and from Roman period sites in the Mediterranean, are mapping the actual commercial flows of the ancient Silk Road in increasing detail. The specific commodities, the specific route configurations, and the specific communities that maintain the road's infrastructure are becoming known with a precision that transforms the Silk Road from a romantic abstraction into a documented commercial and cultural network. The genetic study of Han identity is one of the most politically sensitive applications of population genetics in the world, because the question of who is Han and what Han identity means genetically carries direct implications for the claims of China's 55 recognized ethnic minorities and for the political relationship between the Han majority and minority populations in Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and elsewhere. The scientific findings that Han Chinese is a culturally defined category with significant underlying genetic diversity, that the geographic expansion of Han identity followed political and cultural incorporation rather than population replacement, and that the boundaries between Han and non-Han populations are gradients rather than sharp divides, are factually well established and politically uncomfortable in a context where the relationship between ethnic identity and political rights remains actively contested. The Han Dynasty's most enduring legacy may be the simplest one to state and the most difficult to fully comprehend. It created the idea that China was a unified civilization. Before the Han, the various kingdoms and states of the Chinese cultural sphere were related by a common writing system and shared cultural traditions, but they were not a single political identity. The Han Dynasty made them one through 4 centuries of unified governance, through the expansion of that governance to absorb diverse populations at the edges of the Chinese cultural sphere, and through the specific institutional forms of administration, examination, and cultural production that made Han identity something people could belong to and aspire to regardless of their ethnic or regional origins. That identity survived the dynasty's collapse. It survived the Three Kingdoms period, the subsequent centuries of fragmentation, the Sui and Tang reunifications, the Song and Yuan and Ming and Qing dynasties, and the upheavals of the 20th century. The dynasty that named it is gone. The civilization it named is the largest and one of the most enduring in human history. That is the Han Dynasty's story. 400 years of empire, a billion people's name, 3 men who could not share. The Three Kingdoms period that followed the Han's collapse, roughly 220 to 280 AD, is the most romanticized era in Chinese history. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written by Luo Guanzhong in the 14th century, is one of the 4 great classical novels of Chinese literature. Video games based on it have sold hundreds of millions of copies worldwide. The characters, Cao Cao the cunning strategist, Liu Bei the righteous idealist, Zhuge Liang the brilliant advisor, Guan Yu the loyal warrior, are as culturally present in contemporary China as any figure from the modern era. Why does a period of catastrophic civil war, mass death, and civilizational fragmentation produce the most beloved stories in a civilization's cultural memory? The answer says something important not just about Chinese culture, but about human psychology in general. The Three Kingdoms period was genuinely populated with extraordinary individuals. The specific combination of high stakes, dramatic choices, intense personal loyalty, and the visibility of how individual decisions shaped historical outcomes created the conditions for heroic narrative. The historical record, particularly Chen Shou's Sangguoji, the official history of the Three Kingdoms written in the 3rd century, provides enough detail about the specific decisions, battles, and personal interactions of the period's major figures that later storytellers had rich material to work with. Cao Cao is the most interesting of the 3 major figures precisely because he is the most morally ambiguous. He was, by the historical evidence, genuinely capable. His administrative and military achievements were real, and his governance of northern China in the final decades of the Han provided a level of order that the alternative chaos would not have. He was also, by the historical evidence, ruthless in ways that the Confucian tradition condemned. His massacre of the population of Suzhou in 194 AD, in retaliation for the killing of his father by the governor's subordinates, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left a permanent stain on his historical reputation. The specific accusation that the Romance of the Three Kingdoms makes against Cao Cao, that he was a traitor who used the Han imperial institution as a tool while planning to replace it, is historically complicated. Cao Cao never formally declared himself emperor. He accepted the title of King of Wei from a powerless Han emperor he controlled, but the actual imperial claim was left for his son. Whether this reflects genuine deference to the Han institution that had legitimized his career, a calculation that the timing was not right for a formal dynastic change, or a kind of political theatre whose ultimate intent was obvious to everyone. These interpretations have been debated by Chinese historians across the 17 centuries since his death. Liu Bei's claim to legitimacy, as a descendant of the Han imperial family, fighting to restore the unified empire against the usurpers who had fragmented it, was genealogically tenuous. His imperial descent was distant and barely verifiable, but politically and emotionally powerful. The specific combination of personal charisma, genuine commitment to the people he governed, and the magnetic attraction he had for capable subordinates that the historical sources describe is one of the period's most remarkable phenomena. His kingdom of Shu-Han in the southwest was the smallest and least economically productive of the 3 states, yet it maintained military parity with the larger kingdoms through the genius of Zhuge Liang, the chancellor strategist whose military campaigns against Wei are the subject of the most celebrated chapters of the Romance. Sun Quan of Wu is the least romanticized of the 3 precisely because he was the most pragmatic. He governed the wealthy lower Yangtze region with consistent competence for over 50 years, maintaining the commercial infrastructure that made his kingdom the most economically viable of the 3, while carefully managing his relationships with both Cao Cao's Wei and Liu Bei's Shu, to ensure that neither became strong enough to absorb him. His betrayal of Liu Bei's alliance, permitting the assassination of Guan Yu and the Shu capture of the strategic Jing province, was politically, rational and personally devastating to Liu Bei. It was also, in the broader sweep of the period, the decision that prevented any reunification of the empire under the Han banner and ensured the three kingdoms' stalemate would continue until all three exhausted each other. The Three Kingdoms period ended not with the victory of any of its original protagonists, but with the gradual dominance of the Sima family, the clan that had served Cao Cao and his successors as administrators and generals, and that eventually took the Wei throne in the same way the Cao family had taken the Han throne, controlling a puppet emperor, accumulating power, waiting for the right moment. The Qin Dynasty that the Sima family established in 265 AD briefly reunified China before fragmenting again in the early 4th century into the chaos of the 16 Kingdoms period. The Han Dynasty had created China. The Three Kingdoms period demonstrated that creation's fragility. The subsequent 16 centuries of Chinese history were defined in large part by the specific tension between the idea of unified empire that the Han had established and the centrifugal forces, military, economic, ethnic, geographic, that repeatedly pulled that unity apart. Every subsequent Chinese dynasty began by invoking the Han model and ended by demonstrating why it was so difficult to sustain. The last Han emperor, Emperor Xian, abdicated in 220 AD and was allowed to live out his life as a noble under Cao Wei rule. He died in 234 AD at the age of 54, having reigned in name for 30 years while being controlled by Cao Cao for most of that time. His biography in the official Han history ends quietly. No final battle, no dramatic death, just a man whose historical moment had passed watching from a comfortable distance as the civilization his family had built continued without him. That quiet ending is perhaps more honest than the dramatic deaths that myth would prefer. Empires do not usually end in a single decisive moment. They end in the accumulation of smaller failures, in the gradual withdrawal of the loyalty that sustained them, in the specific morning when someone who had the power to maintain the fiction decided it was no longer worth maintaining. The Han Dynasty lasted 400 years. It was named by the people it governed. It is still named by their descendants. That is not a small thing. That is, in the full weight of historical judgment, about as close to immortality as a human institution can achieve.